So in this video we're going to be talking about my experiences and problems I had with using the Sony A7IV on a full production, which mainly the problems I had was actually with the autofocus, surprisingly, but we'll get into it later on in the video, and also the problems I had with using the APC crop on the 4K 60. So in this video we're going to be talking about all of those experiences I had while I was doing a whole professional production. So let's get into that right now. Alright, so before we begin with my experiences, let's first talk about the gear I was using. First of all, the cameras I already mentioned a little bit before. The A7IV is the main camera, obviously, and then the FS5 as our B cam. So on the B cam, I was using the Tamron 28 to 75mm just to do another angle where I had like another close-up angle, and then later on I changed it to just be a wide angle, you know, just showing the whole set just to get that kind of a vibe going with it. And on the A cam, I was using my favorite lens that I own, which is the Sigma 35mm 1.4, which this is just a beautiful lens, and especially for doing video production, this lens I love. Mainly because the 35mm is one of my favorite focal lengths for getting like a medium to full body shot, and the f1.4 really helps you separate your subject from the background. So, and we were shooting inside of a small apartment, so we didn't have a lot of room to play with. So using a fast aperture lens was vital for this project, because when you're in a small space, if you don't have a really fast lens, then you're not really going to be able to separate your subject from the background, because there's just not going to be enough room to play with. But since this is a 35mm 1.4, it allowed me to just separate my subject from the background, so this lens I love. This is one of the great things about this camera, because since I was using this camera as an A cam besides the FS5, I could use autofocus, which allowed me to use the f1.4 of this lens. If I was manual focusing that, I would not be able to keep my subject in focus, especially a lot of times, you know, when people are talking, they're walking, you know, they're just waddling back and forth. You know, you just can't keep the subject in focus, and f1.4 at 35mm is a very thin depth of field. So if your subject even just moves a little bit, they'll go out of focus. So just being able to use the autofocus the entire time and have it be reliable, you know, that was amazing for this project. And the lighting was pretty simple. I was using the Aperture Amber 200D as my key lights, and then for the diffuser I had a 48-inch softbox with a grid on it, which is actually the same exact setup I'm using. And I actually forgot to bring my LED lights like an idiot to do my shoulder and headlights. So instead I tried to use my Codec SL60Ws, but those lights were way too powerful to be used as a head or shoulder light, and we didn't have enough room to like move the lights back to like diffuse it even more. So instead I just had the light bouncing from the wall, and I put a yellow gel on it just to give it like a little golden glow, just to have better color contrast in the video. And for the audio, I was using the Sony URX P03 lav ear mics, which these things I love because the audio quality is great out of them.
So when consumers are playing our games, whether it be friends or family, I want them to feel genuinely proud, not just of themselves, but of everything around them.
And they have pretty much like unlimited range. Like I honestly, like, I tried doing a test to see how far away you can walk with these, and like I couldn't figure out because it just kept working. But also another cool thing about these lav ear mics is that since these are Sony branded, you can actually get an adapter that lets you pretty much hook this directly up into the hot shoe of the camera, where you don't even have to like plug in any cables. But from my experience, that actually like makes the audio quality a lot worse. You get a lot of noise with the lav ear mics, and it just like doesn't let you like control like the audio levels from the camera itself. It like grays it out. So I honestly don't know why Sony doesn't really sport these older microphones that much, even though they have the ability to be connected right onto the hot shoe. I'm not really sure. I think if you get the newer version, the dual one, it gives you better audio controls, but I'm not 100% sure. Another interesting thing about audio is that I tried using this older Sony hot shoe microphone right here, and this one also goes directly into the hot shoe of the camera, and this one, like, it just doesn't even let you use it. Like, it just says this is not supported. So I guess Sony's just not letting us use their older microphones at all. So if you're ever thinking about buying this microphone, which man, I actually don't know which one it is. This is just like their cheap, you know, hot shoe microphone. Don't get this because this camera doesn't support it, and I know the FS5 also doesn't support it. But the Sony A7IV that I used to use, that camera supports it. So I don't know. They seem to be getting rid of their legacy microphones. But anyways, this is besides the point. This I didn't use in the camera production. I did have a shotgun mic that was connected to the FS5 that I just had like close to the subject's mouth, but I just had that as a backup audio. I do like shotgun mics better than lavalier mics for interviews. But the thing is that for this video, I really want to see how the audio is gonna sound directly from the A7IV. And honestly, it sounds pretty damn good. Now, for any other project, I would probably record the audio either externally or record it through my FS5, which has pretty amazing preamps. The A7IV seems to have like decent preamps, but once you do have to like boost up the amps, you do get a lot of noise with it, which you have to do it with the Sony microphones. For example, the Rode microphone I'm using, I don't have to boost up the amps, so it just sounds great straight out of the camera. And so does the Rode Wireless Go. So those microphones sound pretty great. But anytime you have to like boost up the audio, it doesn't sound that great. So I don't know, you can get away with using the camera's inboard audio, but you would be better off just using external recorder or picking the right microphone that you don't have to preamp that much. Alright, so let's get into my experiences using the camera on production. So this camera has decently changed my workflow when I'm shooting interviews or talking head videos. First of all, I'm using autofocus only. I'm not doing any manual focusing. This camera has 100% reliable autofocus. I can comfortably say that. I did run into some issues, but that was more user error, which we'll talk about. But as you can see, this camera just, for something like this, talking head video, it works perfectly fine. So I was pretty much using autofocus only at f1.4 and it was working perfectly fine. And I shot over an hour and a half of footage and pretty much 99% of it is in focus. That 1% that is out of focus was my fault, and which we'll get into later. And then the second thing that I really changed about my workflow is that I'm not using an external monitor anymore. Now the reason for that is, first of all, I have a flip out screen that I can see from, but that's small. But the main reason why I don't use an external monitor is because I can just use the app in order to view my footage. And there's like, isn't that much lag with it? I mean, there's a little bit of lag with the footage, as you can see, but it's nothing crazy. But it also just allows me to, change all my settings. I can change the aperture if I want. If I'm like, I want to go to f11, then I can change it from here, and then I can go back. I can change the ISO, the shutter, and most importantly, I can do focus pulling from here. I can be like, oh, let me focus in the background, and I can focus back on my face right from the app, which is so amazing. And it literally makes it so that like I don't want to use external monitors because I lose all these settings that I can do. And again, this isn't perfect, but I mean it's pretty crazy, Now you might say, oh, this is like too small, you're not gonna be able to see if there's something in your frame that you want to remove or whatever. But the cool thing is that you can use like an iPad, or you can get yourself an Android tablet, and you can do the same exact thing but just have a bigger screen and be able to see it. And like, this honestly isn't that small, so I mean this is like pretty comfortable to use. The only problem I will say with the app is that if you're shooting an S-log profile, which is what I shoot most of the time, then what happens is that the preview image is also just like gray and washed out, which is the main problem in my opinion with it. Because if you're shooting like this and you want to show your client what's going on, they're gonna be like, oh, why is the image washed out? Because they're not gonna understand what S-log is. And if that happens, what you can do is, for example, you can just quickly change over to s-cinetone on your camera. So here I'm gonna switch over to s-cinetone, and then you can just show your client that, oh, it's gonna look something similar to this, and then you'll have like better colors going on it. And honestly, I like this workflow way better than just using an external monitor, because external monitors I honestly don't like, because they're just big and bulky things that you have to put on your camera. It's something that you have to charge, or you have to put another battery on that you have to like remember to bring. It just adds another thing that you have to do. So I'm not a huge fan of them. So just using my phone as a second monitor is something I do love. Now I do kind of wish that Sony would like release their own like external monitor that you can just wirelessly connect to, like how you're doing with your phone, but just have a better connection to it, be able to put LUTs on it so that you can see what the colors are going to look like. I think that would be great. But besides that, this works out pretty well. I'm not gonna say that you don't need external monitors anymore, but this is pretty damn close. So for most of my projects, I'm probably gonna be using this, especially since, you know, if you do want to do something like focus pulling or something, you know, if you're like showing a product, you can click on it on your hands, you know, you can just focus pull like this, and it'll go to it and it'll track it completely, and then you can go back to your face and like, it's pretty cool. So let's think about the problem I had with the autofocusing, which was actually the tracking mode itself. Now by default, the camera is just on face eye priority, which means that if you have something in front of the frame, it's just gonna stay mostly on your face, just like how it's doing right here. As you can see, if you put it like in front of the face, a lot of times it'll focus to it, so that works pretty well. But first of all, my subject was probably the worst case scenario, which he had glasses on, and the glasses were not glare free. So even though I moved the light so that there wouldn't be too much glare on it, but just by him talking and like moving his head, it was getting a little bit of glare. And he also had his hair that was like covering his forehead, so it was just a hard situation for the camera to find his eye and focus on it. And most of the time it did pretty much great. But when I use the tracking mode on it, which means you click on his face on the either on the screen or in your phone, then it starts tracking what's on it, which I honestly didn't have to do, because you can just leave it on default and it'll just focus on the face. But by doing tracking mode, what it did was that it just focused on his face, but when he would like bring his hand to his face, it would continue to track his hand and then it would lose focus for like a second. Don't use tracking mode. I don't know why I was doing it, but I was just like experimenting to see how it would work. And when I was using it on the other subject, which had short hair, and also he was wearing no glasses, like the tracking mode was working perfectly fine. So there are some situations where the tracking mode does run into some problems, so that's something to keep in mind. And also, this camera seems to be a little racist, because I also did a couple of photo shoots with this camera. I shot around 10 models, and pretty much if I shoot a model that's, you know, has lighter skin, it seems the autofocus seems to work perfectly fine. But I shot this one model which was from Africa, and she had like pretty much like pure black skin, like her skin was really dark. And with her, the autofocus was struggling a little bit. Sometimes they would like find eyes in her clothes and stuff. So the autofocus does seem to favor more lighter skinned people. Because if you have a darker skinned people, I guess it just has hard time tracking. Which again, the first person I was interviewing, he had glasses on and he also had darker skin. So the camera did have a little harder time autofocusing. So I don't know, if you're shooting a darker skin client, that's, I guess, watch out for the autofocus a little bit more, because the camera does seem to struggle a little bit more with that. Now, when I look at the image quality out of this camera, though, it's kind of mind-blowing. Now, it's mind-blowing because obviously the image looks very clean, it looks really nice. I mean, like, even just these YouTube videos that I've been shooting with, you know, they all look pretty amazing. And I shot the video on 4K 24 FPS on the 4K HS mode, so that's what I was shooting the most of it with, and I was shooting the B-roll at 4K 60 FPS, which is also the HS mode. And the thing that I love about the image quality is that when you go from the 24 FPS to 60 FPS, you're not making any compromises when it comes to image quality. Because one thing I hate about a lot of video cameras is that, you know, you'll do like 24 FPS and then the image quality will look great, and then when you go to slow motion on the camera, then the image quality dips. Now as an audience member, you notice that, you know, if your image quality goes from like beautiful 4K 24 frames per second to this like fake upscaled, you know, 4K image that doesn't look good because you turn on the slow motion on the camera, so the camera's, you know, just faking numbers to make it look good. You know, you don't get any of that in this camera. The 4K 60 FPS looks as good as the 4K 24 FPS. But that doesn't mean the 4K 60 FPS doesn't have any compromises. Which obviously is what I'm talking about, is the 4K 60 FPS having an APC crop. And the whole time I was, you know, just limiting myself to see what would happen. And I was using the Sigma 35mm again for the whole production, even at the 60 FPS. So this 35mm pretty much became like a 50mm on the camera when using the 4K 60 FPS. And then I also turned on the active stabilization, which digitally crops into the camera, so this became like a 70mm. So we pretty much went from APC mode to like micro four thirds mode on this camera when we're doing slow motion, which it did make it a little bit harder to film because I had to back up a lot, because this went from like, you know, shooting wide with a 35mm to now we're using a close-up lens. So that's something to keep in mind with this camera when you're doing slow motion. Now obviously I could just use the standard stabilization so it didn't do the digital cropping in, which I probably didn't have to do since we're doing slow motion, so you don't need that much stabilization. And I could also use the 1080p slow motion modes. That would have, obviously reduced the image quality just a little bit, but honestly the 1080p does look really good off of this camera. And actually the next video I'm going to be doing is going to be comparing the different 1080p modes, see how it stacks up against the other cameras like the A7R3 and the FS5, to see how the slow motion looks from this camera compared to the other cameras. So yeah, that was my first experience using the A7 IV in a professional production. As long as you know what you're doing, the camera works amazingly. Just when it comes to the APC mode, you gotta remember to bring an extra lens, which I did have with me. I had this this lens actually, which is the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter. So I could have used this lens just to get a wider field of view. But again, that's something you gotta just keep in mind when you're using the 4K 60 fps, is that you might need to switch lenses just to get that wider field of view. But if you're going to be doing close-ups with slow motion, then you don't really have to worry about it, which it might actually help you with it. And depending on what kind of stuff you do, you might actually have to invest in some APC lenses, like you might get the Tamron 11 to 17 millimeter lens, so that when the camera does crop in, you can still get that ultra wide field of view. But the image quality, even the audio, autofocus were amazing out of this camera. And one of the most amazing things about this camera that is way better than you would get out of the FS5 and the A7R3 or the A7III cameras is that the video codec is so much better than those cameras. Like even with the FS5, the FS5 can do 10-bit video, but this camera is amazing with the 10-bit codec. Let me tell you why. Now the reason why it's so amazing is because with the FS5 or the A7R3, if you're doing any S-Log profile, you have to like nail the focus and the white balance of the camera, because if you don't nail those things, your image looks pretty shitty out of the like when you're editing the footage. Like there's like no room to like edit the footage. Like you can't bring up the shadows, because if you bring up the shadows a little bit, if you don't like overexpose your image, then all the shadows are just like very noisy. And if you overexpose it and you try to bring it down, then you might lose stuff. Like, so you have to like nail the exposure and the white balance of the camera. With the A7 IV, it feels like you're shooting raw. Like, first of all, you don't have to overexpose your image. You can just, regularly expose it. Like right now, the histogram is like towards the back, and like the image looks perfectly fine. And I can bring up the shadows, and there's like no noise in them. If I overexpose the image, I can lower it down. There's just like so much more room to edit with this camera compared to the other cameras, which is so amazing. Because with FS5 and A7R3, I know that if I didn't perfectly get my exposure right, then the image quality just would look terrible. But with this camera, like, even if you mess it up a little bit, you can bring it back in post, which is quite amazing. So anyways, guys, that's gonna be it for this video. Hope it was useful for you. I'm making videos about the A7 IV every single day, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comment section below if you have any questions about the camera, and I might make a video about it, giving a shout out to you. So anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in tomorrow's video.